Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm back with Vincent Stanley, the Director of Philosophy at Patagonia, an apparel company that's one of the top examples of for-profit businesses fighting against climate change and leading the way in environmental sustainability and sustainable development. A lot of our guests here on the podcast work in nonprofits, and so I love having the opportunity to discuss how a for-profit company can integrate environmental sustainability into their work. So thank you, Vincent, for coming to class and then for keeping the conversation going in the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I'll start by asking you, what does it mean to be Director of Philosophy? I have never heard this job title before I met you.
Well, I made it up.
That's great when you can make your own job title.
Yeah, I had operational responsibilities at Patagonia for a long time, and then when I stepped down from that, I had helped Yvon develop what we call
That's the founder and CEO, right?
Yvon Chouinard. Developed the Patagonia Philosophies 30 years ago. There were 8 of them. The origin of the philosophies were in the late 80s. The company was doing very well, but also became rather rootless. We were popular, we were growing very rapidly, but we pursued any opportunity that came our way without really looking at, okay, is this the kind of business we want to be in? And we were adopting practices as we grew that were not in keeping with the original principles of the business. So Yvon started gathering us 20 to 30 at a time, and according to function, like finance went together, production people, salespeople, design. And we go off to someplace outside, like Yosemite or the Marin Headlands near San Francisco, sit around in a circle and say, how is it that we want to do business? How do we develop a business that we're proud of? And those 8 functional philosophies became the heart of Let My People Go Surfing. And Yvon used to teach a class to new employees, seminar style, about 12 people at a time, on the philosophy. So when I was ready to more or less retire, quote unquote, I wanted to teach the classes. We had dropped them a long time before, and I'm really interested when I talk with employees about how these values actually play out in the workplace, because a lot of them, the environmentalism of the company, the social commitment of the company, the constraints that we place on ourselves are actually really inspiring for people, but they also create hardship. If you're a designer for a sportswear company in New York, you can go to the FIT library and choose from thousands of fabrics. If you work for Patagonia, there may be 150 that have been vetted for their chemicals, their effect on the local wastewater, the labor, how the workers are treated. So what I do is I teach those classes. I also am engaged with graduate students, especially here at Yale, between the environmental and the business schools, and also as a kind of evangelist for the B Corp movement.
Okay, I want to ask you about all of the above. And I love the book, Let My People Go Surfing, and forgot to bring a copy with me here today, but I think it goes through the 8 philosophies one by one. And what I'm hearing from you, you used the word values. Every company has like mission, vision, values. And I think what makes these 8 philosophies different is that it's about how you're going to operationalize your values. Right. So it gets really specific, and I love how they stemmed from the core functional areas of the organization. So it really permeates everything you do. And it sounds like, as Director of Philosophy, one of the things that you've helped Yvon build in the company is the culture. It sounds like the philosophy stemmed from the culture because it came from the people, but also it's something that you can actively propagate in the organization, correct? In terms of making sure that incoming people embody these
Yeah.
values and operationalize these philosophies.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. You know, culture, you can't drive culture, but you can cultivate it.
Yeah.
It really is more like gardening than anything else, of kind of looking out for the weeds and also what's productive, what feels healthy, what looks healthy, what affects the business well. One of my interests, because I was one of the original employees, so I've been at the company for 50 years with a little bit of time out for good behavior. And what interests me is that this company that I joined that had 10 employees when I joined. And by the end of the year, we had started Patagonia, so we had like 25, but now has thousands of employees around the world. It was a culture of a little bit alien to me because I was an urban person and a writer, but it was climbers and surfers. Very made really high quality climbing gear. Everybody was very serious about their work, but very egalitarian, very independent. There's something about being in the mountains when you're not near a road that on the one hand makes you very self-reliant and on the other hand makes you aware of your limitations and vulnerabilities. And I think this got baked into our culture. And it's interesting to me that those qualities, especially those qualities of combination of self-reliance and good socialization, have survived in the company over that time.
Have you noticed, they say that placing constraints fosters creativity and innovation. Have you noticed that happening at Patagonia when people like the designers and engineers are constrained? How have you seen that foster creativity and innovation?
I think it's become our business model. And it's interesting. I think there's been an evolution, so that if you had asked me 10 years ago about, say, the idea of the relationship between profit and purpose in the company, I would have said, well, some things made us money and some things we did to do the right thing. 20 years ago, I think you would have had various subcultures at the company. You have the go-getters, the product people who are trying to stay ahead of the competition by 10 years. You have the tree huggers who were giving 1% of sales away, working hard with grassroots environmental organizations and also starting to look at our own practices to try to reduce the harm we do. And then you have the bean counters who are, you know, kind of looking at
microscopic.
Yeah, right. Making sure that something stayed in the treasury at the end of the year or got added to it. But nobody won. None of these groups got along very well.
Because they were all in conflict.
They were all in conflict. But they had to, because nobody won, they had to respect each other. And the culture, I think, almost grew by catalytic action. You know, it just sort of crept up. But somewhere along the line, I think there was a level of experience and a level of trust. We had had enough successes doing business the way we do with this set of constraints that now if I'm an alpine line manager, if I make, you know, raincoats for the mountains, I still want to be 10 years ahead of the competition. I want good market share. I want my line to be beautiful. But I'm also aware that I have to make it in fair trade certified factories. I'm aware that there's a water repellent finish that persists in the environment, and I've got to solve that. And I own that. My team owns that. So I'm not expecting someone from the environmental department to slap me on the wrist. The financial people, one of the things that amazes me, we outgrew our warehouse in Reno. We needed a second one. So the financial team is driving around from Tennessee to Pennsylvania looking for a spot for a 300,000 square foot warehouse. And they're being shown forests, they're being shown farmland. And they said, we can't stand this. We don't want to do this. So they partnered with an NGO to build on top of a reclaimed coal mine.
Oh, wow.
22 layers of coal mine that had been decommissioned 50 years ago. And they did that on their own. Nobody from the environmental department said, you know, gosh, you ought to look out for that.
So it sounds like the three groups of people kind of converged and became integrated.
Yeah.
That reminds me a lot of what we talk about at SOM a lot, because our tagline is business and society, and it's not business or society, it's just really where the two converge.
Right.
And I think Patagonia is really symbolic of that. It sounds like your focus on environmental sustainability changed your business model by making it part of your business model, correct?
Yes. And so those constraints that we place on ourselves do lead to creativity, because you've got to do something different from what your competition is doing.
Like partnering with an NGO to build a warehouse on top of a
right.
coal mine.
Or the designers are very conscious about waste in fabrics, or about the inability to recycle some end product, and so they gather up all the scraps and make a new product out of it. It leads to business innovation, and it leads to product innovation, and I think it's really that's what defines us now, is the innovation that the constraints placed on us. You can't fall asleep. I think a lot of businesses become too dependent on the idea of efficiency, and so they cut their costs another 3% every 6 months. Hard to do now, but rather than really question how a product is made, what its future is, etc.
And you have been telling my students and me that you actually don't really use the term sustainability, even though that's what most people use to talk about environmental stewardship and sustainable development and other terminology. So how do you like to talk about it? What don't you like about sustainability, and how do you think about these topics?
You know, I think sustainable development is a legitimate term. But sustainability in business is a bit of a gloss. I mean, one of the things that we discovered very early on is in the practice of making clothes, that it's very difficult. Most of what we do takes more from nature than we know how to repay. So that by its definition is not sustainable. It's not sustainable,
exactly.
Yeah, we're reducing the harm we do.
It's more mitigation.
Yeah, it's more mitigation. A friend said, it's also not exactly a wonderful word. Somebody says nobody would want a sustainable marriage. You know, it's not.
You want it to be more than just surviving.
Yes, it doesn't indicate the qualities of health or of thriving that you really want to have to define any enterprise.
So you're saying you want it to be more than just sustainable.
Yeah, and we like the word regenerative. And one of the things that opened our eyes is when we got into the food business in a small way with Patagonia Provisions. And we started to understand how if you, the possibilities for regenerating the health of the soil, which throughout the world now, in most agricultural areas, you have about 6 inches of topsoil, and it's dried out and degraded from chemical use. But if you stop using chemicals, use natural inputs, minimal tillage, rotate the crops, do companion planting, you can actually build very rich topsoil very quickly, much quicker than nature can, say 7 years as opposed to half a millennium. And you can sequester carbon. You can very successfully to replace the rainforests we've lost and the capacity of the oceans to absorb carbon because they're overly acid now.
By planting specific crops, do you mean?
No, well,
or by increasing the topsoil.
It's increasing the topsoil.
Okay.
And using perennial crops is helpful because you're not tearing up the soil. But that's regeneration. You know, if you have a practice in business or in any human activity that actually helps nature restore itself or helps human communities restore themselves, I think that that's a better model than just sustainability.
And that's something to aspire to. I mean, mathematically, it would be hard to prove that any company does that, has that net positive effect, but it's a North Star, right?
Yeah, it's a North Star, and you can actually prove it with soil, or you can test it. You know, it's hard to come up with the metrics, even for sustainability. Yvonne and I wrote a book called The Responsible Company, and we used that word at that time, it was 10 years ago, because we felt that anybody can be responsible. You know, you can face up to reality, and then you can make choices about what you do to improve your practices. And I also, we used a quote from a Haida leader, a Western Canada tribe, who said the most important right we have is the right to be responsible. And I think that that's also, going back to your question about culture, that's kind of a key element in a business culture, that people have to have a sense of agency, a sense that they can bring their full selves to work if they're going to bring to their work the kinds of energies that we need now to deal with the climate crisis and to deal with the social crisis.
That's a beautiful quote, that the most important right we have is the right to be responsible. And I think that our modern understanding of capitalism in the past 50 years has taken that right away from businesses, because it's said that you're responsible for maximizing shareholder profit. Not, which is very different from you have the right to be responsible for regenerating the environment and society. And I know that you're involved in a movement that's trying to change that understanding of capitalism and support business leaders in practicing regenerative capitalism, which is the B Lab and B Corp movement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think it's a wonderful movement, one I believe strongly in. It was founded by 3 people who had been friends in college, and 2 of them had actually gone out and started a basketball shoe company. It was very successful. They sold it, and they were really disappointed by what the new owner did, in terms they had established good values and good ethics, how they treated their employees, how they treated the environment. And the new owners brought in the kind of the values of shareholder primacy. So they started a movement of companies that agree to an assessment every 2 or 3 years of just a myriad of practices, everything from the ratio of CEO pay to the lowest paid employer, to whether you use permeable concrete in the parking lot. The assessment has there's 200 points for the top score. Most companies that take the test to determine whether they want to go on that journey, the average score is 55, or has been for a long time, and 80 is the minimum to become a B Corp. And what we like about it is this holistic look at the business. And it really is stakeholder focused. You really look at how the company treats nature, how does it treat its employees, the communities it works in. And one of the interesting things for me is that there's a higher survival rate for startups that are B Corps than for non-B Corps. And I think part of it is because of this holistic look at the business. It involves really good governance. You can't look at three simple KPIs or the simple profit at the end of a quarter, at the end of the year. You've really got to look at how this business works in society, and a business that works in society also tends to be working as a business.
So do you think that having good governance is the root cause of a business, is a shared root cause of both a business having long-term survivability and also of performing well on environmental, social, and governance indicators?
I think it's hard to tell for me to say there's a quid pro quo, because a company can have good values and not such great governance just because it falls down on the job in some ways. It doesn't really examine its practices closely or doesn't make the necessary changes. But in general, I think that having good values and forcing yourself to look at the reality of your company in a larger context can lead to good governance. You can't have good governance without that step.
Okay, so I'm kind of seeing this nerdy diagram of having values leading to governance, which leads to regenerative practices, and also I'm trying to figure out whether the regenerative practices themselves lead to long-term survivability of the company, or whether it's that upstream factor of having strong governance and strong values.
Yeah.
And it's probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So to the skeptic, what would you say if we have a business leader listening to our conversation and saying, but making these choices and investing in regenerative capitalism will lower my profit? What would you say to that person?
Well, I think it's always a question of where are your profits coming from? And I think one of the reasons when I talk about the constraints we place on ourselves leading to innovation to become the business model, we're now, I think, making primarily the money we make is from the type of company we are.
Do you mean because customers are looking for responsible businesses to buy from?
Yeah. And because we develop better products as a result of examining them more closely.
Okay, so that presents a second argument of when you're investing in this innovation through placing constraints, then you somehow do end up building a more competitive product as well.
Right. Yeah.
So there's different pathways to...
Yeah. And, you know, I think some business, it's interesting, most of the business people that I know start a business, they don't start a business to make a fortune, they start a business because they have an idea. There's something they want to do, or there's something they're interested in. And the idea of capitalism that emerged from the Milton Friedman and shareholder primacy is really good for publicly held conglomerates where you're saying, okay, well, I'm not making any money from selling donuts. So I'm going to sell my donut company and I'm going to buy a ball bearing company. And I better do that before the end of the quarter, because I've got an earnings call and we've got to goose that up. That's a very different idea from business than we've had for centuries, where you look for a need and you try to fill it. And it has also led to, I think, finance-driven capitalism, which is really capitalism at its worst, because what you end up doing is developing an economy with people serving the economy to keep it going, because you're afraid of what will happen if you can't, rather than developing an economy that meets the needs of society.
I think one of the things that you're saying is that business leaders are under a lot of pressure to maximize profit, and it's not that they inherently don't want to place constraints that would lead to innovation, and that, you know, perhaps to a certain degree customers are rewarding them for regenerative practices, and the innovation through placing constraints can create a competitive edge, but also then you have issues of investors. You know, there's so many different stakeholders, like the business leaders themselves, the customers, the competition, but what about investors and, like you said, the financing? And that does give me hope, because I know there are a lot of, you know, there is a hypothesis that if funding organizations like the big banks and funds, that if they had access to data on sustainability indicators, they would incorporate that data into their decision making. In addition to financial performance, they want to know ESG, environmental, social, and governance performance of companies. And there's increasing supply for that demand. So in an earlier podcast, I interviewed Jean Rogers, who founded SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And her hypothesis was that, you know, she had on her founding board big funds like BlackRock and I want to say UBS, and State Street and many others, and they were part of this movement of, we want data on ESG indicators in addition to financial performance, and that the more companies provide this data, the more the funds will be making decisions on that. And now I think there are so many opportunities to provide this, for companies to provide this data, and they've all consolidated, like SASB merged with others to create an integrated international reporting framework. So as more and more companies report on this, more and more companies will have to compete on this, in addition to competing on maximizing profit. So if it reaches a critical mass, it could solve that pressure that comes from funders. I think more and more funders are practicing socially responsible investing.
I also think that in addition to that, and that's been a struggle for the past 20 years to figure out the metrics, and then to figure out the relationship of the metrics to profitability. On the other side of it, you have a climate crisis and intertwined with a social crisis that used to be episodic and now it's chronic. And so we've been, let's say you supply semiconductors to Apple, and Apple comes to you and says, well, what's your energy plan? Or you're a company that's heavily invested in by BlackRock. Now BlackRock invests obviously in everything, but BlackRock is still going to the companies, all the companies that invest in, and saying, what's your climate plan? So there are, I think on the one hand you have a shifting idea of the role of business in society. And on the other hand, you have people responding to very negative and existential constellation of forces that we have to respond to in all sectors, from business to government to civil society. So I pretty strongly believe that part of the charge of any business now is to clean up its own act, and in relation to the environment, but also in relationship to people, in relation to how it treats. Because when we talk about taking more from the planet than we give back, businesses have also taken more from people than they give back.
That's true. So I guess my other question would be, what would you say to the skeptic on the other side, not the business leader who's skeptic about regenerative capitalism, but someone who feels that businesses can do more and should do more? Like, for example, even Patagonia, I mean, if you use polyester, I'm trying to think of examples, I'm not an expert on this, in any of your products, then that's petroleum based, and so, nobody has a zero footprint. So to what degree and how do you feel that Patagonia and other business can do better?
Oh, a lot. And one of the things that, it's interesting to me, because I'm less cynical than I was in the 90s. And partly, and by cynical I mean, if you ask me, it's not a matter of optimism, but I have more faith in the human capabilities than I did 30 years ago.
That gives me hope.
and it's because of the things that we've learned how to do. That you face a problem and you solve it successfully, and you go on to the next one. So for us, it's a real question of how we're actually committed to not using virgin oil in the production of any nylon or polyester. We want over the next 10 years to convert, it's not just for our food, but we want to convert cotton cultivation to regenerative organic practices. And those things are kind of exciting to do. So the more you succeed, you can take it to that next step, that next more complex or more difficult step.
Do you have any closing thoughts or words of wisdom to people who are just starting out in their careers, whether they might be starting their own business or nonprofit as a social entrepreneur, or whether they work in a company like Patagonia or other and want to be an intrapreneur to try to find ways to innovate for regenerative capitalism? What would you share in closing in terms of the things that have made you hopeful over the years and the things that you think are happening next and ways that you feel that anyone might be able to get involved in building this movement?
Well, I think there's sort of two different strategies if you're an intrapreneur or an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And I think for the intrapreneur, there's a wonderful example. Danone, big French yogurt and water company, is committed to becoming a B Corp, the whole business. And when they bought the largest organic dairy business in the US and converted it to Danone North America, they wanted to make it a B Corp within 3 years. They did it in 1 year.
Oh, wow. I was going to say 3 years is ambitious because they must have so many moving parts.
1 year was, and this is $1 billion business. So, no, more than that, 6 billion, I think. In any case, the woman who really was responsible for the work told me that she thought that it was possible because of the commitment of the younger employees. That you had about 100 employees within the company who were really working hard to make this happen. So I think if you're an entrepreneur, that what you want to find, first of all, you want to find a sympathetic environment, which Danone was and which Unilever tends to be. And then you want to find allies and you want to have a good project to do. For an entrepreneur, I think I would go back to the stakeholder model and say that whatever you're going to do, it's really important to understand what your values are and how you're going to build the business on the basis of those values. Then that you communicate that to each one of your stakeholders. So you want to be talking the same way to your investors as you do to your employees, your suppliers in the community. You don't want to set up expectations. You don't want to tell your investors, well, I'm doing all this fancy stuff, permeable concrete in the parking lot, and But really, let's talk about the bottom line and the return on your investment 5 years from now. No, you want everybody's expectations of what you want the business to be shared.
I think there's also an opportunity for extrapreneurship in terms of innovating also across the boundaries of multiple organizations, and that's how you can also shift those expectations. And I know that with B Labs and B Corps, there are so many organizations that are trying to do that kind of collective action to convert others to regenerative capitalism, to create climate policies and to conduct climate advocacy. And so I think that both if you are an entrepreneur running your own business or if you're an intrapreneur within an existing company, you can also join forces with multiple other companies to create that kind of environment, that broader environment that will allow regenerative capitalism to become the norm rather than the exception.
Right. No, I think that's what the B Corp movement is about. It's interesting to me that you often get, in a particular area, people support each other. So in a particular, say Parma, where the Davinas, which is a skincare company, became a B Corp and influenced all these other businesses, from a pharmaceutical company to a major pasta making company, to get interested in the movement, and some of them become B Corps and some don't. But in addition to, I've never heard the word extrapreneur before, but
it's not really a word. My students and I use
like
it jokingly, right? Because entrepreneur, you start a new company, intra is within an existing one, but it's like, why stop within the boundaries of any one business? We need to work across multiple organizations.
Yeah, but there's some extra possibilities there, and that is that one company's waste can become another company's feedstock. So when you're looking at complex environmental effects and you're trying to solve them. I don't know enough about this to really talk intelligently about it, but I know that Yvonne is invested in an aquaculture project that is actually land farming salmon. Mm. But they're using feed, they're using rice husks. The problem with rice husks is they generate methane. So what they're doing is they're putting guppies, a form of guppy, into the rice paddies that actually consume the methane. Mm. And then the bones of those fish become fish food. So everything is sort of, you know, one problem is solved and creates a product that becomes part of this ecosystem of companies. So it's not just activism, it's also, I think you have tremendous possibilities for really looking at solving, how do you solve a problem in the food supply? How do you solve a problem in housing? How do you solve a problem in clothing? And the ways in which you do that are usually multiple. So
everything is interconnected,
yeah.
and that oftentimes leads to a ripple effect that is negative, I think, when you're thinking about your supply chain and the harm it does.
Yeah.
And I think that it also presents an opportunity to think about, well, how can your supply chain incorporate some of these opportunities for regenerative growth? Thank you so much, Vincent. This has been truly inspiring, and I think you brought up a lot of resources that our listeners can refer to for more information. There's the B Lab movement and the B Corps, and then there's Vincent's book, The Responsible Company, and Yvonne Chouinard's book, Let My People Go Surfing, and so much more. So I think that really, no matter what your job is, whether you're an entrepreneur, an intrapreneur, a funder, you have the opportunity to think about this interconnected web and how you can try to connect the pieces together in a way that's more regenerative. Thank you so much, Vincent, for inspiring all of us and for all the work you've been doing the past 50 years.
Okay. Thank you, Teresa.
And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.